Hey everyone, my name's Adam. This show is called Defogging Pokemon Battles. Have you ever had a moment when playing Pokemon where you suddenly feel out of your depth? For me, this was in Pokemon Emerald when I first got to the Battle Frontier. Up until then, I felt like I had a really good grasp on the game. I beat the Elite Four, and they were a challenge, but not too much of a problem, and generally I felt like if I was in over my head with a particularly challenging trainer, I could just grind and level up, and eventually I'd be able to beat them. But once I got to the Battle Frontier, something changed. I suddenly had to actually start using strategy, and it was at that point that I realized I had no idea what I was doing. Pokemon is easy enough to grasp at a surface level, and frankly the games aren't that hard anymore, but it turns out there's actually a lot going on under the hood. If you've beaten Pokemon a few times, but gotten to something like the Battle Frontier, or the Battle Tree, or your first online battle, and suddenly felt like you were missing something, like you didn't even know how to win, then this series is for you. This series will start with some general information on the competitive scene, then we'll take a look at some of the basic mechanics of Pokemon battles, and eventually we'll move into strategy and team building. When we start talking about battles, I'm going to start pretty basic. I'm going to assume that you've played through the game at least once and know what a Pokemon battle looks and feels like, but we are going to cover fundamentals before we get into any kind of real strategy. Sound good? Alright, let's get started. Welcome to the meta. Playing Pokemon at an advanced level feels very different. You're going to be dealing with Pokemon whose levels and stats are fully maxed out, and getting them to that point takes time. Fortunately, there's a great tool called Pokemon Showdown. This is a team building and battle simulator that you can use for free in your browser. It was developed by some really dedicated people, and in fact, this is where a lot of the competitive meta lives nowadays. Think about Showdown as a place where you can build and test out your ideal team without having to spend the time to get everything to level 100 on your own. My recommendation for anyone who wants to get better at battling at the competitive level is to start playing Pokemon Showdown. It can come as a shock to some people that the best way to develop your strategy in Pokemon battling is to play something that's outside of the actual Pokemon games, but I promise Showdown is really fun and addicting once you get into it. What a lot of people will do after they finish a normal campaign in Pokemon is go play Showdown in order to test out different teams, and once they found one that they like, they'll go back to the actual Pokemon game and then put in the work to breed and trade to get the team in game. A huge portion of the community also just plays Showdown, and there's not really anything wrong with that either. If you haven't tried Showdown yet, I would recommend hitting the link in the description and starting to experiment on your own. A lot of what's covered in this video series is going to be easiest to test out on Showdown. So it turns out, Pokemon is extraordinarily unbalanced. What do I mean by that? Remember the underlying message in the early games and in the anime that it was a great strategy to try to win with your favorites, to pick the Pokemon that you liked, and then to train them to a point where they would be competitively viable? Turns out, that's not actually possible at a high level competitively. You might see a few of your favorites on the competitive scene, and you might even get to use them, but in order to be successful, you're going to have to get comfortable with some Pokemon you might not be familiar with. The Pokemon fan community has effectively created different weight classes for different Pokemon. Each tier contains a set of Pokemon who are competitively viable against each other. If a certain Pokemon is seeing a lot of competitive use, it goes up a weight class. This has created an environment that allows lots of different Pokemon to be used, not just the strongest ones. These categorizations happen at a website called Smogon, and they change all the time based on votes by the community. Official Pokemon tournaments don't use these weight classes, but instead use something called VGC rules. We'll get into that more a little later. Right now we're going to start getting into damage calculation. Hit the link to episode 1 where we'll start going over this equation.